titled Pure Comedy. Hey everybody, thank you for tuning into the voice of your college. You are tuning into WVYC, and I'm your host, Keelan Tollinger, from 3 to 4 this afternoon. This is the February 22nd, 2019 edition of In the Studio, and if you missed last week, don't worry, you can go online to youtube.com and search my channel, that is In the Studio with Keelan Tollinger, and find an archive of all the past shows. Except for last week, haven't got that one up yet, but I'll soon be back on track, hopefully this weekend. Might be a good idea to subscribe to my channel in the time being so you can know exactly when an archive video goes live, and you can listen in at your leisure. But yeah, I feel sort of behind on things this week. I mean, sleep for one thing. That's especially the case, since even before midterms, things have gotten pretty crazy in my courses now. Thankfully, I was able to catch up a little bit on sleep with yet another snow day on Wednesday. I think it's been 3 successive weeks where the weather has caused either a delay or a closing, and I'm talking about it during the intro, but this time they definitely had to do something, though. I was sort of pessimistic that even though the forecast said we'd be getting 4 to 6 inches of snow, maybe the college would kind of like wait and see, maybe fit in a couple daytime classes, but no, it was a very fortunate thing that nobody was inclined to step out the door on Wednesday morning. Dr. Gunter Smith here at the college released a updated snow emergency procedure a few days ago, and one of the points inside of it was that the school would make a decision by 5:30 a.m. involving opening and closing. So I set my alarm for 8 a.m. anyway, just to be perfectly prepared and have my expectations shattered, but no, come around like 5:15 a.m., finally the notification came through and school was canceled. I just sort of feared the worst because, at 11 o'clock that night, every school within like a 15-mile radius had like already announced it was going to shut its doors. They really stick to their commitment here to just monitor the immediate vicinity's conditions and like follow the lead from nobody else here in the city. But yeah, the snow kind of rolled through in just a matter of hours. I think it was finished by lunchtime, and 5 inches or so were already piled up by then. There was a delay on Thursday morning for reasons I don't entirely understand, maybe just like finishing up the cleanup, some ice on the roads. But I can tell you that based on what I said during the intro last week, this time, this snow emergency, the main campus residents could finally put their vehicles under the parking garage so they wouldn't have to be covered. And it wasn't like the snow was going to last long to begin with, because like most of it's already gone by now. You could see patches of grass outside the window. Thursday's afternoon high was in the 50s, and it really made short work of everything on the roads, on the ground. So basically, though, I needed Wednesday and Thursday to recharge after a long week. And when winter break begins next Friday, that's when I can really settle back and stop thinking about my senior seminar and writing all the time, at least until I should probably do my taxes at home. But just to reiterate, next Friday is when winter break starts, so unfortunately there won't be a March 1st or a March 8th show for me, I think. I'll be back on the 15th, hopefully, with a lot more to cover, because honestly, this week I've just been so disconnected from the news and all the headlines. But what's on deck for this show includes some one of my favorite topics this month, an artificial intelligence program that is producing its own news stories and writing convincing articles, and the engineers behind it are afraid to release the full thing to the public. I'll talk a little bit about the Jussie Smollett case, the dreadful reversal of the whole thing that has been taken in like the past week. Colin Kaepernick also settled his grievance against the NFL a little while ago, so I'll sort of chronicle how he got to that point and what the dealing might mean. The Democratic presidential candidate race is already starting to heat up already this early, so far away from 2020. And because there will probably be like such poor timing regarding the end of the Robert Mueller investigation too, I think I might as well kind of like offer my predictions about it before I take 2 weeks off from the show, because the media is sort of signaling that it's just about finished. And lastly, I want to finish up with some discussion about writing in the disciplines, or WID. This relates to an academic curriculum and like courses here at York, and I want to talk about why it's more necessary than ever to evaluate the program now that it's basically 4 years old. So this should be a great show with everything we need to cover, and I hope you can stick around. But for right now, let's kick off the hour with some music. So this song is called Waiting for Something to Happen by Veronica Falls, and I will be back in 3 minutes here on WVYC. Stay tuned. Welcome back to 88.1 FM WVYC, the voice of your college. That was from Veronica Falls, titled Waiting for Something to Happen. So this first story of the hour that I'm going to talk about might sound like something completely out of the realm of science fiction. I mean, this was written in an article by Ars Technica on the tail end of last week. So it all starts with OpenAI, a supposedly non-profit research company investigating, quote, the path to safe artificial intelligence. Because we know what unleashing algorithms can do on even the most innocuous things like search results. I talked extensively about this whole YouTube debacle last semester. But this new type of AI that this company released wasn't made to suggest content. It was created to produce it instead, drafted up from scratch. So the whole system worked along the lines of if you feed this computer program a small writing prompt, then it will spit out a small article in exchange. It was built out of a huge collection of writing found on the internet, of thousands and thousands of words, sentences and articles, comments on items, and by reading and memorizing what these things were doing, then it could create highly believable news stories, even if they were completely made out of thin air. If this is already sounding like real-life fake news, then yeah, it basically is, and it gets worse. So OpenAI's researchers were actually so unsettled by what they created. This is actually called the GPT-2, which stands for the Generative Pre-trained Transformer 2. It's like a mad scientist invention. But they basically withheld parts of this program. The examples the machine used to learn about writing, essentially dumbing it down so it didn't have its whole dictionary to work with. They wrote, quote, due to concerns about large language models being used to generate deceptive, biased, or abusive language at scale, we are only releasing a much smaller version of GPT-2. They wanted to stick to only ethical research here, because if it got in the hands of some online news source that only wanted to go out and trick people, I mean, there could be all kinds of problems ahead for the world of news media. And for me, it's especially shocking because I thought that the last bastion of hope for the workforce would be the humans in charge of communication. Maybe I didn't want to become a journalist, which an artificial intelligence program like this could pretend to be. But I mean, still, a person's mind has the advantage of a robot's because we understand the context of things better than anything else on the planet. And we know that so much information is chronicled and collected by the human experience. So if we ever teach a machine how to fake what it's like to retell that experience, then we sort of blur the line between what's true and what's fake. But this article wrote that GPT-2 didn't lose track of any of the context it was writing about. It was able to tell a headline and then keep generating details about the event, through essentially fake witness testimony and details. But let me read off some of the prompts that were included in this article before I move on. So the researcher just had to put in 2 sentences about an event. And let the machine do the rest. So what it came up with was a story about the economic impact of Brexit, before the effects of Britain leaving the EU are fully understood, by the way. A report of nuclear materials being stolen from a facility near Cincinnati. An article about Miley Cyrus being caught shoplifting. A rant about why recycling is bad for the earth. A speech written by John F. Kennedy's brain after it had been transplanted into a robot, including notes about how it had been accomplished, and a rewrite of a scene from the Lord of the Rings movies. Lastly, a student paper about the causes of the Civil War. They apparently even had this thing be able to generate fake research papers. And I mean, there's no obvious signs about the correctness or quality of the writing in the eyes of an instructor or something about this machine, but I mean, teachers will have to be on the lookout for students that get machines to write their work instead of plagiarizing it with word for word copy and paste off of Microsoft Word now. It's just a lot to I guess drink in. But I've got some more to talk about regarding this, but we've just reached the quarter of the hour here on WVYC, so let's take a short break and I will give you the weather check. So currently, to go back to the news here, to give you an example of how tough this sort of writing is to spot from this GPT-2, let me read you a few paragraphs from one of these fake news stories that GPT-2 wrote up. So these are all direct quotes. Dr. Jorge Perez, an evolutionary biologist from the University of La Paz, and several companions were exploring the Andes Mountains when they found a small valley with no other animals or humans. Perez noticed that the valley had what appeared to be a natural fountain surrounded by 2 peaks of rock and silver snow. Perez and his friends were astonished to see the unicorn herd. These creatures could be seen from the air without having to move too much to see them. They were so close they could touch their horns. While examining these bizarre creatures, the scientists discovered that the creatures also spoke some fairly regular English. Perez stated, "We can see, for example, that they have a common language, something like a dialect or dialectic." And yada yada yada. However, Perez also pointed out that it is likely that the only way of knowing for sure if unicorns are indeed the descendants of a lost alien race is through DNA. So, like, doesn't that sound professional and academic enough? Just like, what if someone came along and like read that on a website, obviously not knowing that the publication it was from was like recognizable enough, and they wound up like passing it along through Facebook or telling their friends about it. Because like most of the time I think they'd be debunked pretty quick, but it still looks like a bad omen about the authenticity of news when there's examples like that can be produced already. Now, one disclaimer about this whole thing is that the GPT-2 took several tries to get things right. It isn't perfect by any extent. I think one example they gave is that it wrote sometimes that fires were breaking out underwater, just like insensible things that sort of give off the suspicion that a decent reporter really wouldn't have wrote that. But when it comes down to it, I'm just simultaneously amazed and appalled. It's like the use of commas in that auto-generated article I just shared were all placed in grammatically correct spots. The language use was pretty solid. I just think we can't really let artificial intelligence run things as culture-based as writing, because it's our thing, basically. We created it, the whole language and the lettering system, and no matter what we do, we shouldn't just like surrender it. And have it start like being produced for us because it'd be faster and easier. Now, like, would we maybe want to watch movies or read novels produced by robots instead? I mean, well, if they can do it right and like nail every aspect of what keeps us entertained, then maybe it's possible to give it a shot in the future. But for information-based writing that we would use to like teach others and communicate our experience, it just seems problematic to give up. But in the end, I'd give credit to this OpenAI for basically saying, yeah, we made this, it's possible, but here's a junior version of it so you can see what it can do. I would hope that like teams don't come in and start building more parts, more intelligence for it, and use it to basically drive a fake news campaign or write fake customer reviews on Amazon products or something, or for restaurants. But these are like essentially the stakes that we're up against in the future. I mean, we can teach programs a lot about what we as humans do if we try hard enough to boil it down to math equations and stuff. But yeah, if this team can do it, others can do it too, and that's something that really makes you think. But anyway, I've basically talked about this long enough, I guess, and it's time for another music break here on In the Studio. And this next one comes from the breakthrough album from Peter, Bjorn, and John called Writer's Block, all the way back from 2006. Here is Objects of My Affection. I'll be back to comment on the Jussie Smollett case in a few minutes here on WVYC. Stay tuned. Welcome back to 88.1 FM WVYC, the voice of your college. I'm your host, Keelan Tollinger, and that was Peter, Bjorn, and John with Objects of My Affection. So going on to this next story, it's been developing for several weeks now, and I think it's just about reached its conclusion within the past day. This is about Jussie Smollett, an actor for the Fox series Empire. Well, we know the whole saga now, it seems, like, started with the report of an apparent hate crime in which two men attacked this guy with, I think it was bleach, threw a noose around his neck and shouted racist and homophobic remarks, using a slogan from Trump's campaign to further entrench this whole assault on disdain for Smollett's identity. And very quickly things started to unravel once the Chicago Police Department brought in the two brothers that turned out knew this person from the beginning. And people have started to have their doubts that this was an authentic crime in the past. And what sort of bothers me the most is that his appearance on Good Morning America, where he was interviewed saying, like, who would lie about this? I can't believe that there's people who would call me a liar and everything. And doesn't it hit like a bit hard that he was the one lying to the cameras on national TV? It's like acting, I guess, on a different set. But overall, I think like the depiction of the alleged attack was bad enough that it was supposed to, I mean, rightfully, by the way, it was supposed to point out the problem of white nationalism and racism that we're still struggling to get rid of in this country. but it wasn't even real, and it kind of leaves a bitter taste in the mouth to know that it was apparently a ploy to get this guy's salary a raise, paint himself as a victim, and television executives can't just let a member of the personnel go when he's attacked, I guess. I guess that was supposed to be the idea. And it's interesting because Fox did side with him at first, when he was still being treated as the victim, like not under any suspicion. But I would say the logical thing they just did is to pull him off the show, especially if there's a guilty verdict. And I know the whole innocent until proven guilty thing is like kind of like tossed out these days. It's kind of discarded, but I mean the prosecutors seem to know with certainty that they have their guy. I just think it's interesting the most how the story slowly turned itself around as far as coverage went. So when it was like brought up that Smollett received a threatening letter addressed to him at his studio, I mean that story barely even reached any coverage back then. This was about a month ago. But why would the sensible thing to do to like raise the stakes and involve other people? I mean the thing with the letter could have just been laid to rest. I mean nobody would have known it was a fake as well if this recent event wasn't sort of compacted on top of it. And I know it would have been trying to do if the letter made headlines in the first place, but to do something more outrageous in response is just really silly. And I mean, as soon as the two brothers were caught, it was all going to fall apart in the first place. So yeah, I think the general sentiment that I've come to, at least, is that Smollett is pointing out that we do have a problem with tolerance toward our neighbors. And undeniably, there are lesser known individuals that become victims of these crimes, and we don't face the issue no matter how many times the media puts it in front of our face on occasion. But the contradiction to that, I think, is like the worst drawback of trying to raise awareness of that is doing so only to get your own financial or reputational gain. Because that seems to be the only point here until Smollett says otherwise. I don't see an activism angle to this, and in the end, it's really just exploiting the true victims of hate crimes. And honestly, it's a shame that until the story is like fully out of the news cycle and in our minds, like the recent future could just be full of unneeded skepticism about incidents like these. But anyway, that's sort of my quick segment about this, and there might be more to come regarding it, but that'll do for now. Let's move on and get into some more music like this one from the station playlist. Here is Rosanne Cash with Sea of Heartbreak, and featuring Bruce Springsteen. You're listening to 88.1 FM WVYC, and I will be back soon. Welcome back to 88.1 FM WVYC, the voice of your college. That was actually I'm With Her with Call My Name. Had a little bit of a mix-up there that I had to address really quick. But we're back, and it is a little bit past the half-hour mark here on In the Studio, so let me read you the hourly PSA here at the station, and we will get on with some more news. So let's turn now to some news in our government. The stories are starting to gather up that the Robert Mueller investigation, which has been hanging over the head of the president ever since the election, is coming to a close. The results may be out within the next week or so. I probably won't be the first to report it, but as far as the investigation into Russian interference with the election goes, there's been some signs that a few members of Trump's inner circle had some questionable ties to a foreign entity, but nothing yet that seems to be severe enough to derail his entire presidency. So basically, I mean, this new Attorney General, William Barr, will get the report in the near future, and he'll decide how much of it is too confidential for the public. But then he'll pass it along for Congress to scrutinize. And I'm happy at least that somebody in the higher order of our government didn't just go, you know what, this is stupid, so let's pull the plug on it or something. They're going to let the investigation carry itself out all the way. And I think the long period that this whole thing has taken, and the fact that like people in Trump's inner circle sort of dropped away and he's still standing there makes me sort of think that there's nothing really severe about him that would like pin him down as an illegitimate president. Maybe I don't think there's any direct cooperation with the Russians here. I mean, that country simply meddled with our election, and the Americans put on trial here are for the most part like just caught in the web, like lying in their own defense, dealing with a list of money troubles. I mean, the list goes on, but Trump, I guess, seems just too simple to me to have been like a direct Russian puppet of some kind. What I think might emerge in the investigation are ways that Trump sort of played into their hands, maybe. Like instances that he tried to interfere in the investigation, maybe, to keep some of his acquaintances clean. maybe that would do it. But in the end, I think the American population ultimately put Trump in that chair. But beyond anything, I mean, the report that comes out will probably do nothing to change your mind about President Trump. I mean, that's for sure. So, I mean, if he turns out to be relatively innocent, that only strengthens his base and disappoints his opponents, and that seemingly must be what we're heading towards. I mean, considering there's been nothing, even these final stages, that is telling us there's something specifically like illegitimate and corrupt about the president. I mean, the first sign that something would have said there's a problem, I mean, he would have been hauled out of there, I think. So I'm just expecting just a host of missteps that he's made in the end. But as I'm sure Trump will happily announce, no collusion. But on to the future, though, the opposition that the Democrats are mounting to compete on the ballot for 2020 is getting really crowded. So first of all, at this moment, the front runner, who isn't even officially on the ballot yet, is Joe Biden. And meanwhile, there's some familiar faces like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren stepping into the ring to be more progressive, diverse as well. The first Hindu woman in Congress, Tulsi Gabbard, a representative from Hawaii, Amy Klobuchar, like apparently a centrist, Kamala Harris, a daughter of Jamaican and Indian immigrants. There's Julian Castro, who entered last month and might have an advantage with the Latino voters. I think the party wants a lot of different perspectives than an old white guy, if I could put it that frankly. But I've got to ask, like, is there an identity in one of these candidates that works for everybody in the party? I think the most important factor to me right now, honestly, is can they deliver a powerful speech without, like, putting a bunch of people to sleep with repetitive vocabulary? But, I mean, I'd also say the less polarizing the candidate race can be, the better. I mean, like, Clinton and Sanders went down to the wire, and I think the bad blood between voters of each trying to settle out those differences cut into the turnout during the 2016 election. That's just my perspective. And maybe there'll be some more discussion about prominent candidates throwing their hats in the ring down the line, but for now, that'll do for the big picture. I think the most pressing news right now is the Mueller investigation, and maybe there'll be a follow-up on that. But let's get right back into the music for the hour, though, which comes from our station playlist here at WVYC. Coming up next is from Pause MC and their song Build Up. Stay tuned. Welcome back to 88.1 FM, WVYC, the voice of your college. That last song was from Pause MC, Build Up, on the station playlist. Obviously the radio edit. But going back to some quick news that I'd like to cover regarding the world of sports next. So Colin Kaepernick and one of his former teammates on the San Francisco 49ers, this is Eric Reid, they've both settled their grievances with the NFL for an undisclosed amount of money. It's been a battle ever since October 2017. No further comment from either party has been put forward. Basically, it's done. Probably millions of dollars for each of them, but I don't think there's an end to the saga just yet on the horizon. Because his lawyers say that Kaepernick would still like to play football again at the professional level if one of the 32 teams would pick him up. And I'm not sure if that's going to happen for the upcoming season, for one thing, because I have to wonder if part of the deal was for him to walk away from the league for a while or something, or at least the money is due to the NFL executives having acknowledged that the movement he started has made some ripples in how the game is managed and spent. Like $90 million of the league's revenue has gone towards social justice measures since the protest started. If there wasn't actually anything for the lawyers to settle about, I mean, there wouldn't have been a settlement, basically. I mean, it essentially began and ended on Kaepernick's terms about who was being affected by this movement. And I think what he wanted was some kind of political and cultural reform. And he has that with like a large chunk of his fans behind him. I mean, performers who wouldn't sign onto the halftime show at this year's Super Bowl as well. And just after the settlement, Nike released a jersey with his number on it. And it was just a plain old black and white design, not affiliated with any team. They call it their Icon series. And it's already sold out. And it cost $150 each. He is just raking it in with that Nike endorsement and the sponsorship he signed. But one thing I should bring up, though, is that Kaepernick seems a bit picky about where he's going to continue his career next. I talked about the Alliance of American Football last week and how it's supposed to be a developmental league for players who'd maybe like to get back on an NFL field, show they still have some talent. He was offered to join one of their 8 teams before their league started, but apparently he wanted $20 million to do so. And I said, like, every player's salary is supposed to stay at $250,000 for a 3-year deal. That's what I said last week. And And that to me just kind of says he has a lot of belief in his talent for not seeing a field in a few years now. And there's signs that he's still practicing, staying in shape, visiting training camps, even meeting with like youth football groups and being seen as an inspiration, but he's not really capitalizing on the athlete part. And I think putting up paywalls that have to be met for him to showcase his performance is an obstacle he's putting on himself. And there's just no way a newly formed league is going to fork over the equivalent of like 80 players' salaries just to have his skills aboard. I think it would honestly generate more controversy about a league to have him in it. Well, I mean, any publicity is good publicity, but right now it's just when I suspected that Kaepernick is pretty comfortable with his Nike deal, and the company probably doesn't mind he's not a traditional athlete right now. I mean, like they described it, he's just an icon. But speaking of Nike, you maybe have seen the story of one of their shoes breaking during a big college basketball game between the number 1 Duke University and the 8th ranked North Carolina University. So in the first 30 seconds of the game, this number 1 NBA draft prospect in the country, Zion Williamson, he stopped to change direction really quick, and it basically, like, his shoe blew apart, like the bottom half of the inside just separated, his toes broke through. I mean, it caused like the most watched player in the nation to get a knee sprain. And he's just a freshman phenomenon who Duke obviously needed on the court because they wound up like losing that game. But Nike stock took a plunge in that event, but I guess they have a nice day on the markets more often than not anyway. But that's just about all I've got regarding sports, and we're coming up on the close of the hour in about 15 minutes. Let's say we get the second weather check of the hour under our belts. Let's try to fit one more song in the hour, and I'll close out with a discussion of what makes writing a collegiate setting successful, at least according to what the research that I've looked at is saying. But coming up next on WVYC is a song from Matt Kearney titled Ships in the Night. You're listening to the voice of your college, and I'll be back in a few. Stay tuned. Matt Kearney with Ships in the Night here on 88.1 FM WVYC, the voice of your college. I'm your host, Keelan Tollinger, and there's one last major discussion I think I'd like to have for the afternoon that has to do about quality of writing. So, I mean, every student has got to do it. I mean, professionals, in like career managerial positions, say that communication is probably the number one skill that they want. And it doesn't even have to be writing. It can sort of be working with others. I mean, sharing your ideas, being collaborative in a way. So how is a college supposed to make sure their students are prepared for that? I think the college tried to answer that question a while ago and are getting around to creating the answer. So go back maybe 20 or 30 years and look at what goes on in academics, and for the most part, a lot of curriculums sort of thought that writing and communication was in some kind of like independent domain. Like you need to learn how to write, but maybe just do it for the work you'll do in college, the papers, the essays. And so much of it stress correctness in either grammar or spelling, and that helps a bit from a professional standpoint. Don't misunderstand me on that, but there was kind of a shift towards doing it right and doing it effectively, if that makes sense. So being an efficient and productive communicator, it takes know-how. It takes thinking about things in the terms and style of a professional in one's respective field, basically. How do you communicate like a doctor or a physicist? And like, remember that if you're just learning how to write papers, that you'll get like a passing grade while in college. I mean, once you're out the door, things change, and the least thing you'd want to be is unprepared. So that's where the emphasis on writing in the disciplines was based upon, or WID. So it's okay to teach things at a higher level than high school and get students ready for college work. But it's got to be supplemented by actual practical communication that take place in the field. But think of the like faculty-student ratio here at your college. Like there's practically no doctor that usually teaches how to write like a nurse. There's mostly instructors that want you to act and perform as one. So how are you supposed to apply writing in the disciplines if you know it's needed, but you can't really include it in the 8 semesters a student usually has on campus? So that's where this college's Generation Next program came in, I think. It's been around for about 4 years now. I'm one of the guinea pigs, as well as the entire senior class, who was supposed to get 2 required classes about just general communication. That was essentially FCO 105, which everyone takes in their second semester here. And then one of 3 FCO 200 level courses, which if you're a freshman, you'll need to take whichever one your degree requires at some point. I think of 105 as like the standard academic course about like what in general are some types of essays, papers, and research like strategies a person will have to use in college. But the 200s, they're basically like divided into communication and professional cultures, which I'd say is more for like the marketing. Scientific and technical communication, which I'd maybe say is like the nursing and biology, and interdisciplinary communication, which I would say maybe the humanities, everybody else in between. And they're kind of like vague sounding, but they're all different in their own ways, these professions. But they might seem like a bit too compact for the dozen of majors that you take at the college if we're looking at these FCO courses. And I mean, again, there's no way there's space for every major to get a class about writing like a this or that. Some instructors of certain disciplines, like gerontology, hospitality management, I mean, those teachers, honestly, wouldn't be expected to know what makes good writing in their fields. I'm sure they've seen it, and they could point towards, like, good textbook authors or something, but for the most part, so many of these instructors assign communication projects so that students generate and demonstrate knowledge about their field. It's kind of like Wild West rules. Well, I shouldn't compare it exactly to that. It's more like mysterious. It's like a crystal ball about what goes on within the communication of these schools of thought, because each and every one of them want a different mark of quality. And how are the three FCO 200 level courses supposed to cater to all the students who are just going to splinter off and learn more things about what makes them good at their major, basically? Now you sort of see the difficulty that the curriculum developers here face, like trying to make sure that nobody goes through FCO 105 and their FCO 200 and say, as a senior, like, well, I never learned how to talk or write about this. And I would say now that I've been examining this sort of problem for a few years now, and a lot more closely during my senior seminar in writing, I think that the best way is to build awareness that there's types of communication out there. And then there's disciplinary divisions, schools of thought, like I was saying, that sort of reinforce it. So we all know what genres are. I'm not talking about like novels, but more like a memo or a lab report or a group presentation and a pie chart. Like each of these has their own style, their expectations about what's good, things they have to do right to get the message across, because all communication is goal-based. And then on top of that, these genres need subject matter. I mean, knowledge and information put into them to get across to the audience. I mean, whoever that might be. A client, a boss, a group of civilians trying to understand why their building might fall down if the engineer doesn't do it right. That's ultimately what's important here. I mean, knowing the genres that each discipline deals with, the information, and the kind of quality of all those facts and what they're supposed to be. And then who's going to be reading that communication and making sure it's catered to them. It's a pretty tall order, I guess. I mean, it makes designing a writing program around that so much harder for the brief time a student's going to be focusing on a communication. And then they're off on their own. So one thing that I can definitely tell you helps is just asking the instructors what's going on. How do they feel about the way their students communicate? What do they need to know in order to make it in their field? What sorts of writing and presentations and stuff do they produce in class? And honestly, the more detail that can be gotten out of these faculty about what goes on in the disciplines, I mean, that helps refine the FCO 200 level courses to understand what genres are prioritized, which audiences are important, stuff like that. And now I'd say is a good a time as ever to see how the Generation Next classes are doing, now that an entire senior class is on their way out with this method of instruction, this pseudo writing in the disciplines approach. Because it isn't going to be as perfect as a big university that can get all sorts of different majors and pay instructors to hold courses that might focus on the ins and outs of writing for a field. We're a special case at the school, making do with like what we have, but the only way to know if that's enough or if we can do better is just checking with the faculty about what's going on and how do they feel about their students' ability to communicate like professionals. But anyway, I guess that was kind of a ramble, but hopefully if you're a student, you get a bigger picture of what's going on as far as the whole writing structure here, especially if like communication isn't everything to you, and you'd like to know what's the use of going to these FCO courses. I think that the communication departments will be quite happy to know like what these students think about what they learn in these courses in the future. So if you got the thoughts on your mind, be on the lookout for surveys. I mean, like, writing students and professors both give them out on occasion trying to understand how the craft is taught. But with all that being said, I think that'll just about do it for this edition of In the Studio with Keelan Tollinger. Go online to youtube.com and search that if you'd like to hear more with some past editions on my channel. And I hope that I can catch you 2 weeks from now over the air when spring break is finished up, and we'll be about a third of the way there by then towards the end of the semester. But thanks for joining me this afternoon on WVYC, and we will leave things off with Joji and Dancing in the Dark. Have a good weekend, everybody, and a fantastic break.